All right, so imagine this. Have you ever felt invisible? Like you're just there, but nobody really sees you. Nobody hears you? I had that feeling a lot. But then, one night at Jackson's Diner, everything changed. I lost my job, yeah, but I gained something way bigger. Jackson's Diner was like the soundtrack to my life. The flickering neon sign, the cracked red booths, the smell of fresh coffee, and that old, broken jukebox. It was my safe harbor while I chased my dreams and paid my bills. Like every other night, I was wiping down the counter after a long shift when the red 50% off for veterans sign cast a dim glow on the sidewalk outside. The bell above the door chimed. I looked up. An elderly woman stepped inside. You could tell she was carrying an invisible weight. Her cardigan was worn, her shoes scuffed, and in her hands, she clutched a neatly folded military cap. The way she held that cap, it was like it was the most precious thing in the world, like it belonged to someone who should have been sitting right there with her. My heart clenched. I smiled. Welcome to Jackson's. Just you tonight? The woman hesitated. Then she nodded. Yes, dear. Just me? Her voice was soft but tired. I led her to a quiet booth near the window. She sat down carefully, placing the cap on the table like someone was going to come pick it up. I swallowed hard. I grabbed a coffee pot and came back a few minutes later. I poured her a warm cup and set it in front of her. What can I get for you? She glanced at the menu, then quickly looked away. Her fingers curled around the cap. She was squeezing the fabric, like she was trying to draw strength from it. I don't have enough, she murmured. Her voice was barely a whisper. Something tightened in my chest. I'd seen this before. People too proud to ask for help, even when they needed it the most. Without hesitation, I smiled. It's on me. The woman's head snapped up. Her eyes widened. There was something between surprise and shame in them. I can't let you do that, she whispered. She was shaking her head. I knelt down, gently put my hand over hers. It's just dinner, I said softly. Then I glanced at the cap on the table. And looks like you earned it. The woman's lip trembled. She swallowed hard. She was blinking rapidly, like she was trying to hold back emotion she didn't want to show. Finally, after what felt like forever, she nodded. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't wait for more. I just smiled, gave her hand a little squeeze. Then I got up and walked to the register. I pulled a crumpled $20 bill from my own pocket and rang up the order myself. I had no idea that one small act of kindness was about to change everything. The hum of the diner faded into the background. I placed the plate in front of the woman when a sharp voice cut through the quiet. Emily, a word. My stomach twisted. I knew that tone. I turned slowly. Carl Benson, the diner's manager, stood in the doorway of his office. His arms were crossed. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw told me everything I needed to know. I tried to stay calm. Yes, Carl. Carl walked towards the counter. He glanced at the plate of food in front of the elderly woman. Did she pay for that meal? I swallowed. No. Carl sighed sharply. You used your own money? I nodded. Yes. Carl scoffed. And you thought that was okay? My hands clenched at my sides. She's a veteran's wife, Carl. She just wanted a warm meal. Carl let out a dry laugh. That's not your problem. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She lowered her gaze. Anger rose in my chest. So that's what we do now. We throw out veterans' families because they're struggling. Carl's lips pressed into a thin line. You break the rules, you pay the price, he said coldly. That's how it works. Then he turned to the woman. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The entire diner went silent. The elderly woman's hands trembled. She reached for her military cap. Her face flushed with embarrassment. Something snapped inside me. I had two choices. Stay silent and keep my job, or stand up for what was right. I made my choice. No. The single word hung in the air. Carl's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? I straightened my shoulders. She's not going anywhere. Carl took a step closer, towering over me. This is my restaurant. If I say she leaves, she leaves. I didn't back down. If you're kicking someone out, it better be me first. A tense silence stretched between us. Carl's nostrils flared. Then he made his decision. You're fired? My breath caught. I knew it was coming. But hearing the words still hit me like a punch to the gut. The elderly woman gasped. Oh, dear. No, I didn't mean to cause. I turned to her and managed a small, reassuring smile. Don't apologize, I said softly. You didn't do anything wrong. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached behind my neck, untied my apron, and folded it neatly before placing it on the counter. My hands were steady. My heart was not. Carl smirked. Doors that way. I lifted my chin. I know where it is. I turned towards the exit. Every step felt heavier than the last. Just as I reached the door, the bell above it jingled. The door swung open. A group of soldiers walked in. I froze. 5 men in uniform stepped inside. They moved with a quiet confidence. Their presence immediately commanded attention. Customers turned in their seats. Whispers rippled through the diner. Carl's smug expression faded. The lead soldier, a tall man with sharp eyes and a firm stance, surveyed the room. Then his gaze locked onto me. Who's Emily Carter? He asked. I blinked. I am. The soldier nodded. We need to talk. Carl cleared his throat. Gentlemen, this isn't a military facility. If you're looking for food, we can... The soldier ignored him completely. His gaze remained on me. We heard what happened here tonight. My heart pounded. How did they? Then he turned to the elderly woman, still sitting in the booth. Ma'am, is it true that you are the wife of Lieutenant Colonel Mark Holloway? The woman gasped. Her lips parted. For a moment, no words came out. Finally, she nodded slowly. Yes, I am. The soldiers immediately straightened their postures. One of them, a younger man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. I serve under your husband, ma'am, he said quietly. He saved my life. A soft cry escaped her lips. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I felt my own throat tighten. The lead soldier turned back to me. What you did tonight, he said, it didn't go unnoticed. My mind spun. I just paid for a meal, I murmured. The soldier shook his head. No, you did more than that. You showed respect when no one else did. His gaze flickered to Carl. Carl shifted uncomfortably. The soldier continued, and we don't take that lightly. I didn't know what to say. My hands were still clenched at my sides. Adrenaline was still coursing through my veins. Carl scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. Well, I'm sure this is a touching moment, he said, but she's no longer an employee here. She's free to leave. The soldier smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. Oh, she's leaving, he said. With us. I stared at him. With you? I echoed. The soldier nodded. There's someone who wants to meet you. My stomach flipped. Carl looked between us, his eyes darting nervously. Who? I asked. The soldier's lips curled into a knowing smile. You'll see. I stood motionless, trying to process what had just happened. The soldier's words echoed in my mind. There's someone who wants to meet you. I swallowed hard. Who? And why? I felt like I had just stepped into something far bigger than myself. Carl, my now former manager, let out a dry chuckle, his arms folded across his chest. This is ridiculous, he scoffed. She's a waitress, not some war hero. The lead soldier's gaze snapped toward him, and Carl instinctively took a step back. No, the soldier said evenly, but she understands honor, and that's more than I can say for some people. Carl opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it, realizing there was nothing he could say. I felt a strange mix of emotions, disbelief, uncertainty, and something else I couldn't quite name. I had spent the past few minutes accepting that I had just lost my job. Yet now, standing in front of these soldiers, that seemed like the least important thing in the world. The lead soldier motioned toward the door. Come with us. I hesitated, looking back at the elderly woman, still seated in the booth. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking slightly, but there was something in them now, something lighter, freer. I gave her a small nod before turning back to the soldiers. I took a deep breath. Then I followed them out the door. The air outside was crisp. The streetlights cast long shadows along the pavement. A military vehicle sat parked at the curb, its engine humming softly. "Where are we going?" I finally asked as the soldier opened the door for me. "You'll see soon enough." I climbed in, nerves buzzing through me. The door shut behind me, and the vehicle pulled away from the diner. Silence filled the cabin as we drove through the city. I glanced out the window, my mind racing. What could possibly be so important that a group of soldiers had come looking for me? After what felt like an eternity, the vehicle finally slowed, turning down a quiet road lined with tall iron fences. At the end of the street stood a large, well-lit building with an American flag swaying gently in the night breeze. A military base. My stomach twisted. The vehicle rolled to a stop and the door opened. The lead soldier motioned for me to step out. I did, my shoes crunching softly against the gravel. "Right this way." We walked toward the building, past guards who nodded respectfully at the men leading me. I felt like I had stepped into a world completely separate from my own. The lead soldier opened a side door and gestured for me to enter. As soon as I stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. Sitting at a large oak desk, in full uniform, was a high-ranking officer. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. But what caught my attention wasn't his uniform or the rows of medals pinned to his chest. It was a look in his eyes, one of deep, unwavering gratitude. He stood as I entered, his gaze locked onto mine. "You must be Emily Carter," he said, his voice steady but warm. I nodded. "Yes, sir." The officer motioned toward a chair in front of his desk. "Please have a seat." I hesitated before sitting down. The weight of the moment settled on my shoulders. The officer leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "I heard what happened tonight," he said. I swallowed. I didn't think it was anything special. It was just a meal. The officer's lips pressed together. "Not to us." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small frame photograph. He set it on the desk and turned it toward me. My breath hitched. It was a photo of a younger version of the elderly woman from the diner, standing beside a man in uniform. He looked strong, proud, his arm wrapped tightly around his wife. The officer exhaled. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Holloway was one of the best men I ever served with. He saved lives on the battlefield. He sacrificed everything for his country. I felt my throat tighten. The officer met my gaze again. His wife has spent the past few years struggling, trying to make ends meet. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, someone reminded her that her husband's sacrifice still mattered, that she still mattered. I blinked rapidly, fighting back the sting of tears. "You didn't just pay for a meal," the officer continued. "You gave her back a piece of dignity. And that is something we don't forget." For the first time since losing my job, I felt something other than anger and uncertainty. I felt pride. The officer stood and reached into a small box on his desk. When he turned back, he held a pin, a small but significant military insignia. He stepped around the desk and gently placed it in my hand. "This is a token of our appreciation," he said. "It's not much, but it's our way of saying thank you." I looked down at the insignia resting in my palm. I had never served in the military. I had never stepped onto a battlefield. But in that moment, I felt like I had done something that mattered. I looked back up at the officer. "Thank you, sir," I whispered. The officer gave me a firm nod. "There's one more thing," he said. "We run a veterans outreach program, and we need people who care. People like you." My eyes widened. "You wanted to work with you?" The officer smiled. "If you're interested, yes." I let out a shaky breath. Just a few hours ago, I had lost my job. Now, I was being offered something much more meaningful. I didn't hesitate. I'd be honored. The officer extended his hand, and I shook it firmly, and with that, my life changed forever. Carl Benson stood frozen in the middle of Jackson's diner, his face pale, his breath short. Applause erupted around him. It started with just a few claps, a woman near the counter, a man by the window, and then within seconds, the entire diner was on its feet, cheering. Customers who had been quietly finishing their meals just moments ago were now standing, clapping, nodding at me in admiration. "She did the right thing," a woman called out. "This is what respect looks like," another added. Carl's jaw tightened. He scanned the room, searching for at least one person who might agree with him, someone who might back him up, but he found none. Then his phone rang. The sharp vibration in his pocket made him flinch. He fumbled for it, his hands suddenly clammy. When he saw the name on the caller ID, his stomach twisted. The owner of Jackson's Diner. Carl hesitated for only a second before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was sharp, clipped, and angry. "I just saw the video," the man snapped. Carl felt his entire body tense. I can explain," he stammered. "You fired her?" The owner's voice was ice cold. Carl swallowed. "Sir, I can—" "What the hell were you thinking?" the owner barked. "Do you have any idea how fast this is spreading?" Carl's heart pounded in his chest. His fingers shook as he pulled the phone away from his ear, tapping frantically at the screen. And then he saw it, a video of the entire incident. Filmed by a customer sitting near the window, had been uploaded. It already had hundreds of thousands of views. Carl's stomach dropped. The caption read, "Waitress stands up for veteran's widow, gets fired on the spot." His eyes darted down to the comment section. The words blurred together in a mix of outrage and disgust. "This is disgusting. Who owns this place? Never eating here again. She deserves a promotion, not to be fired. Somebody find this girl and give her a job ASAP." Carl's grip tightened on the phone. And then his boss spoke again, his voice low and full of warning. "If you don't fix this right now, I will make sure you're the one looking for a job tomorrow." The line went dead. Carl lowered the phone slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. His gaze flickered up to me. I was still standing near the entrance, my expression unreadable. The applause was finally dying down, but every single person in that diner was still watching him. Carl licked his lips, trying to gather himself, trying to salvage what was left. He took a breath and stepped forward. "Emily," he started, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. I think we might have been a little hasty." I didn't respond. I just tilted my head slightly, watching him. Carl let out an awkward chuckle. "I mean, we can work something out. Maybe reconsider." I held up a hand. "Stop," I said. Carl blinked. "What?" I took a deep breath. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in this place before. Power. "I don't need this job," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I never did." Carl's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I shook my head. "You didn't fire me because I did something wrong. You fired me because you were too much of a coward to do the right thing." Carl's face flushed red, but he had no response. I took a step back, letting my final words settle in the air. Then, without looking back, I walked out the door. And that's when I heard it, the deep, rumbling engine. I froze. A large military vehicle had just pulled up in front of the diner. The door swung open. A soldier stepped out, the same one who had come into the diner earlier. But he wasn't alone. Another vehicle pulled in behind him. Then another, a convoy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The soldier walked toward me with a small, knowing smile. "Ms. Carter," he said, stopping a few feet away. I swallowed. "Yeah." The soldier studied me for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me. I hesitated before taking it. When I unfolded the page, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just any piece of paper. It was a job offer. "I told you," the soldier said, his voice steady. "There's someone who wants to meet you." My fingers tightened around the letter. I looked back up at him, my mind spinning. "What kind of job?" I asked cautiously. The soldier's smile widened just slightly. "The kind where you can actually make a difference," he said. I stared at him. Just a few hours ago, I had thought losing my job was the worst thing that could happen. Now, As I looked at the military insignia printed on the letterhead, I realized it might have been the best. The soldier took a step back, motioning toward the waiting vehicle. "Well," he asked, "are you coming?" I let out a slow breath. Then I nodded, and with that, I climbed into the vehicle. My old life behind me, my new one just beginning. I sat in the back of the military vehicle, staring down at the job offer in my hands. My fingers traced over the official letterhead, the military insignia embossed at the top. I still couldn't believe what was happening. Hours ago, I had been a waitress. Now, I was being offered something far bigger than myself. I lifted my gaze to the soldier sitting across from me. "A different kind of job?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. The soldier nodded. "We're expanding a veteran support program," he explained. "We need people who actually care. People like you." I felt my breath catch in my throat. All my life, I had worked just to get by. A paycheck, a routine, a way to survive. But this was a chance to actually make a difference. My mind flashed back to the elderly woman in the diner. The way she had gripped that faded military cap, like it was the last piece of her husband she had left. I had seen the way the world could be cruel and indifferent to those who had sacrificed the most. And now, I had a chance to do something about it. I exhaled slowly. What would I be doing? The soldier smiled slightly, sensing my growing interest. "Helping families of veterans," he said, "making sure they don't fall through the cracks. We need people who can connect with them. You already have that instinct." I stared at him. I thought about my old job, about how Carl had treated that woman like she was invisible, like she didn't matter. I thought about how many others out there were struggling the same way. This was my chance to change that. I met the soldier's gaze and nodded. "I'm in." The soldier's smile widened. "Good choice," he said. The vehicle rumbled forward, carrying me toward a new future. The next morning, my name was everywhere. My phone was buzzing nonstop with calls and messages. Friends, family, even people I hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out, congratulating me, thanking me. I didn't fully understand why until I turned on the TV. My face was on the screen. A national news anchor was talking about me. The story of a young waitress who stood up for a veteran's widow and was fired for it has captured hearts across the country. What started as a small moment of kindness has now turned into a movement, sparking conversations about how we treat our nation's heroes and their families. My stomach flipped. I watched in stunned silence as the footage from the diner played on the screen. The confrontation with Carl, the moment I took off my apron, the soldiers walking in. Then came clips of people reacting online. Social media posts flooded the screen. This is what humanity should look like. We need more people like Emily in the world. Veterans and their families deserve better. My chest tightened with emotion. I had just wanted to do the right thing. I had never expected this. The camera cut back to the anchor. In response to the overwhelming support, several organizations have reached out to offer Emily new opportunities, including a veterans advocacy program, where she will be working directly with military families in need. I blinked. It was real. This was really happening. My phone buzzed again. I looked down. It was a message from the elderly woman I had helped. "Thank you, Emily. I thought the world had forgotten about us. But because of you, I know that's not true." I pressed my hand against my mouth, overwhelmed. I had lost a job, but I had found something much more important. A purpose, a chance to stand for those who had stood for their country. And it had all started with one simple act of kindness. I let out a slow breath and smiled. Sometimes, doing what's right doesn't just change someone else's life. It changes yours. To that in today's world, kindness often feels like a rare commodity. People are too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to stand up when they see something wrong. But Emily's story reminds us that one small act of compassion can change everything. She didn't think twice before helping a veteran's wife. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because it was the right thing to do. And yet, that simple act of kindness had a ripple effect, turning into something far greater than she ever imagined. How many times have we seen someone in need and walked away, thinking, "It's not my problem"? Maybe it was a struggling veteran at the grocery store, an elderly neighbor needing help, or a single mother counting change at the checkout. It's easy to look away, but what if we didn't? What if instead we chose to step in, to defend, to help, even when no one is watching? Here's the truth. The world doesn't change through grand gestures. It changes through small, everyday acts of decency.